Everyone. Thanks for being with us here today. I'm Stephanie Haney, and we are about to have a conversation about something historic that's happening in the Congress in Washington, D.C. as our 118th Congress in the House of Representatives tries to get underway. So I've got two representatives here with me from Case Western Reserve University. From the law school, we have Professor Jonathan Entin. Hello, Professor Entin.
Good morning.
And from the political science department, we have Professor Justin Buchler. Thanks for being with us, Professor Buchler.
Welcome.
Okay, so I'll start with the question here about just how we're feeling about how unusual this is, because this isn't something that's happened in 100 years, that there has been a Speaker of the House who failed to get the vote on the first try. So from a political science perspective, I'll ask you how we should wrap our minds around that, Professor Buchler.
So obviously this is very historically unusual. It hasn't happened for 100 years. Normally what happens is you have internal votes within the caucuses for party leaders, and what tends to happen is that you get two things playing out at once. First of all, you have a majority party which holds an internal vote, and if somebody gets a majority vote within one caucus, the party then rallies around whoever gets that majority vote. So you wind up with the party rallying around whoever just gets a majority vote, and that would have been Kevin McCarthy. And so one of the things playing out is that you've got a bunch of members of the Freedom Caucus who are not doing what the majority party normally does. The other thing is that you have Kevin McCarthy, who has decided that he's not going to recognize a vote count. So after Speaker John Boehner was forced out, Kevin McCarthy did a vote count. He understood that he did not have the votes to get the gavel. And eventually how that played out is that Paul Ryan became Speaker because he was able to get the support of the Republican Caucus. And this time around, Kevin McCarthy decided that he was going to try to barrel through, even though he did not have the votes to do it. So you have these two forces playing out at once. One is that the majority caucus, the majority party has this caucus within it, which does not want to play by the same kinds of processes that a party normally uses. And the other is you have a party leader who basically thinks that he can call vote after vote after vote and try to get that minority faction within the majority party to play along, and it's not working. I'm not sure why he thought it would work, but he thought it would work.
It is certainly not working, that's true. So up to this point, the House will reconvene at noon today. There have been 6 votes. McCarthy has failed to get the votes that he needs in order to secure that speakership. Professor Entin, I want to ask this question of you now. What is the significance of this? Why do we need a Speaker of the House to be elected?
Because the Constitution says that the House shall choose its Speaker. He is the Speaker, he or she, as in the case of Nancy Pelosi. The Speaker is the presiding officer of the House. And until a Speaker is chosen, the House can't do anything. The members can't be, the members who've been elected cannot be sworn in, and the committees cannot be staffed. The House cannot do any business. That means no laws can be made. And at some point, that's going to be a real problem because, for example, we have the debt ceiling that will have to be extended at some point in the first few months of the year, and that would be a pretty major problem. But as I said, the House cannot function at all until a Speaker is chosen, and that's because the Constitution says that the House has to choose a Speaker.
Now, when we look at what the Constitution says, I'll direct this again to you, Professor, and then Professor Buchler, also feel free to chime in, either of you at any point on these questions that I'm asking, but I'll direct this one to you because it's more legal in nature. The Constitution says that the House has to choose its Speaker, but McCarthy is making all kinds of concessions to try and get this speakership. Is there anything else laid out anywhere that says what he can and can't do to try and get elected as the Speaker?
The Constitution simply says that the House shall choose a speaker. The Constitution doesn't say anything more about the process. The Constitution doesn't even require that the speaker be a member of the House, although every speaker so far has been one. But some folks have suggested that maybe in the event of an impasse, people should look to some respected figure from outside. But that seems like a very unlikely possibility.
And that would be
In other words,
especially interesting because the Speaker of the House is second in line of succession to the presidency. So just let me ask both of you your opinions on this. What would that look like in a world where the person who is behind Vice President Kamala Harris in succession to the presidency is someone who is not an elected representative of the people?
Well, we've had that situation once before. When Gerald Ford was vice president, he was not elected by the people. He was appointed under the 25th Amendment to replace the elected Vice President Spiro Agnew. And then when President Nixon resigned, Ford became president, and he appointed, again, under the 25th Amendment, he appointed then New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. So we have had this situation. It's not a great position to be in, but that's the way the system is set up.
Do you have a comment on that, Professor Buchler?
I think this kind of speculation is a little bit absurd. The likelihood that the House is going to elect a speaker from outside the House is extraordinarily low. If you look at how the debate is playing out, there is still a chance that McCarthy manages to get the gavel, although the probability of that started honestly pretty low and has been going down. But if it's not McCarthy, it is much more likely to be Steve Scalise or somebody like that. The likelihood of the House rallying around somebody outside the chamber is just extraordinarily low. I just don't see that happening.
Okay, let's talk about some of the concessions that McCarthy has made. Can you tell us, Professor Buchler, about some of the things that he's offered up to these, detractors, I guess we'll call them for lack of a better term?
Sure. There have been a lot of concessions. The most important is what's called the motion to vacate. So removing a speaker, it has historically been rather difficult. And the sort of Damocles that has been hanging over the throats of previous speakers, and in particular John Boehner, was the threat of a motion to vacate, which is a vote basically to remove a speaker. And the question is, how many members does it take to offer a motion to vacate? So what McCarthy did not want going into his speakership was a threshold of too few members of the caucus offering a motion to vacate and putting it on the floor to force a vote to remove him as speaker, because then he just effectively has no power as speaker. And what he has been forced to offer the Freedom Caucus and the detractors, if we want to call them that, is a motion to vacate being offered by just one member of Congress. So if one member of Congress, any one member of the House of Representatives, can offer a motion to vacate, then anytime Kevin McCarthy, potentially as Speaker, if he manages to get the gavel, does something that alienates one member of the Freedom Caucus, they can offer a motion to vacate. And keep in mind that with only 222 Republicans, it would not take all that much to remove him. And if we remember all of the difficulties that John Boehner had as Speaker, this is a much more contentious caucus. This is a much more fractious caucus. This is a much more narrow majority. It will be all the more difficult for him to do anything, which means that for all practical purposes, McCarthy has already bargained away every bit of power he would have as Speaker, just by saying that the motion to vacate could be offered by one member of the House of Representatives. He's given away every bit of power he would ever have.
Now, if one person brings that motion to vacate, then I'll ask this again to you, Professor Buchler. How many people need to vote to remove him in order for a vote for a new speaker to then come to pass?
Oh, it would be a majority vote. And that's the basic problem, is we're right back here. And keep in mind that we're back here with this narrow majority, that the Republicans only have 222 seats. And all of the problems that Kevin McCarthy is having right now, he would have over and over and over again. So effectively, by offering a rule in which a motion to vacate could be offered by one single member of the House of Representatives, he would have no power, because he could not afford to alienate so much as one single member of the Freedom Caucus.
Okay,
Well,
let's talk
but
about that
let's-
power now. Excuse me, go ahead,
Let me
Professor
just
Entin.
pick up on this for a second, because as Professor Buchler has said, it takes a majority to vacate the chair. So how much of an actual threat this might be depends on what the Democrats decide to do in this situation as well. I mean, a speaker doesn't want to be in the position where this vote of no confidence can come up at any time. But whether the speaker will actually be removed will depend to some extent on how much support the speaker has within his own caucus, but also what the Democrats decide to do. And the Democrats may not necessarily want to push McCarthy out of the speakership unless they think that they're going to get somebody who would not be a bomb thrower out of the Freedom Caucus. So it's hard to say, but we shouldn't. I mean, for institutional reasons, it's really problematic to make it too easy to set up a vote to remove the speaker. And just by way of comparison, there in the last Congress, legislation passed to amend the Electoral Count Act, the process for counting electoral votes for the presidency. Under the previous version, one senator and one representative would be sufficient to force a vote on an objection, and the threshold was raised. And the reason for that was that it was too easy to have objections to electoral votes. And the concern about one member being able to move to vacate the chair, the speaker's position, is similar. Is that too low a threshold? And whether the speaker is actually going to be pushed out or not, it's an enormous distraction.
Sure.
I would actually add to this, though, that from the Democrats' perspective, I could see them deciding to go along with a motion to vacate just to cause chaos. The Republicans are not going to be able to do anything. They're not going to pass any legislation. There will be no legislation. So from their perspective, if one member of the Freedom Caucus offers a motion to vacate, and I'm Hakeem Jeffries, I say, sure, go along with the motion to vacate just to cause chaos. If the Republicans want chaos in their ranks, let them have it. It doesn't cost them anything, because one way or another, it just looks bad for the Republicans. And if I'm Hakeem Jeffries, that's what I do.
Well, and maybe that's right. Maybe Jeffries would see things differently. My point is simply that how credible a threat this motion to vacate is not just a function of the dynamics within the Republican caucus. It also will depend on what the Democrats decide to do.
What a, quite frankly, disappointing position for our democracy to be in, where we're in a position where people are inviting chaos. I'll just say that as someone who this Congress works for. They work for us, right? They do, and we want them to do their job. So it is a disappointing scenario for sure. Now, Professor Entin, I do want to touch on some of the things that are the responsibility of the speaker. So when we talk about some things that might prompt this motion to vacate, some things that might upset members of the Freedom Caucus or Democrats in order for them to jump on board with a motion to vacate, what does the speaker do? What is he responsible for?
The speaker is responsible, in a formal sense, for presiding over the work of the House. When the House is in session, the speaker is normally in the chair presiding. But the speaker has other power about constituting committees, or at least making the final call about who's on committees. And speakers have adopted, and Professor Buchler probably can fill in more details on this, but some speakers have been more powerful than others, either because of their personality or because of things that have been happening more generally in Congress at various points in history. And if we get past the kind of the personality issues, if you think about some of the objections that the McCarthy opponents have raised, they're saying that the speaker has become too powerful, that the rank and file and the committees do not have as much authority as they ought to have. That's what the appropriate amount of power is at any given moment is open to some discussion. As I said, we've had stronger and weaker speakers over the years, and it's not just a function of a small majority. Speaker Pelosi had a pretty small majority, and she was a much more effective speaker than some speakers who had much bigger majorities. So the speaker is essentially the first person, the leading figure in the House of Representatives, and what happens in the House is largely a function of the speaker's own view of the position and what the speaker can do in relation to the other members.
Okay. Professor Buchler, did you have more you'd like to add there?
Yeah. So, I mean, just first in response to something you said a moment ago, Congress does not work for you. One member of the House works for you. If you live in Chantel Brown's district, Chantel Brown works for you, and she is the only member of the House who works for you. If you live in Jim Jordan's district, Jim Jordan works for you, and he is the only member of the House who works for you.
I meant in the collective, but yes, exactly what you're saying.
There is no collective. No, there is no collective. One member of the House works for you, and that is it. Congress does not work for you. So this is actually important.
They work for us. They work for Americans. Each person works for an American, yes.
Yeah, but it's important to understand that dynamic because there are 20 members of the House of Representatives who are blocking Kevin McCarthy, and those 20 work for 20 distinct House districts. And it's important to understand that dynamic. Okay, that said, in terms of understanding what makes a speaker powerful or weaker, there are a couple of things going on. One is the internal ideological homogeneity or heterogeneity of a caucus. So one of the factors that helped out Nancy Pelosi relative to the modern Republican caucus is that there has been a little bit more willingness within the Democratic caucus lately to work together than the Republican caucus, not necessarily because they see policy the same way, but because they see their tactical processes the same way. So if you look within the Republican Party, they tend to have very similar policy objectives, but they disagree a lot on the proper way to pursue those objectives. And because they disagree, they do not necessarily want party leaders to be powerful. And party leaders will only be as powerful as their members will allow them to be. In political science, the jargon for this is conditional party government. And because there is disagreement within the Republican caucus, they do not want as powerful a speaker. So if you look over the last several years, one of the complaints of the Freedom Caucus is limitation on amendments on the floor. And you can take your own position on whether or not that should be the case, but the limitation on the power of the speaker, just in terms of the structure and dynamics of the caucus, have to do with the internal homogeneity and heterogeneity of the caucus. The other factor is whether or not the party leader actually understands political strategy. Nancy Pelosi was a brilliant strategist, and part of what made her a brilliant strategist was that she understood how to count votes and who needed what incentives to change a vote. And one of the things that we are seeing is that Kevin McCarthy is terrible at this. He is objectively bad at this. So one of the ways that we assess party leadership in political science is with what we call a roll rate, which is the rate at which a party leader is rolled, meaning beaten on the floor. Kevin McCarthy hasn't even gotten the gavel yet, and he has been beaten 6 out of 6 times. He is objectively terrible at this. One of the basic rules is you never bring a proposition to the floor unless you know you have the votes to win. And he has done it 6 times and lost 6 times because he didn't have the votes to win. He's bad at this. He is really bad at this. So one of the basic differences between Kevin McCarthy and Nancy Pelosi is not so much personality, but Nancy Pelosi could count and Kevin McCarthy can't.
Well, comes down to basic math sometimes. All right, I've got one more question for each of you, and I'll start with you, Professor Buchler. What is it that the Freedom Caucus wants, and who do you think is likely to actually win the speakership when this is all said and done?
So there's a faction of the Freedom Caucus that just wants to defeat Kevin McCarthy. There are some demands that they have, like the motion to vacate being offered by just one member, freedom of amendments, and a few other demands. But a lot of them really just don't want Kevin McCarthy, and they want to beat Kevin McCarthy. And if that's what they want, then this doesn't end until Kevin McCarthy yields. And the question that we have to have answered is whether or not it really is the case that they just will not accept Kevin McCarthy. And it's kind of looking that way. As for how this plays out, right now it looks like a race between Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise. If you're betting, I don't know. I mean, I would lean a little bit towards Steve Scalise, but Kevin McCarthy still has a chance, but there's nothing that he can do to placate people whose only goal is to see him lose.
Okay. And Professor Entin, what is your take on that?
I don't have a crystal ball. I don't claim to be clairvoyant. But my sense is that even if Kevin McCarthy somehow manages to eke out a majority of those who are voting at the end, he will have relatively little leverage because he will be so beholden to the most extreme members of his caucus. I think more generally, if the House has had this much difficulty choosing a speaker, we should not expect much of any constructive action out of the House of Representatives over the next 2 years. And I think we should be concerned about whether the House will be able actually to do some really basic things, like, for example, avoiding a default on the national debt. At some point, there will be a speaker, there will have to be a speaker, but this is exhibit A of dysfunctional congressional dynamics. This is not something that we should feel good about, however it plays out.
Okay. Well, thank you both for your time today. Thank you for this insight on what's happening with the vote for the Speaker of the House. Professor Entin, Professor Buchler from Case Western Reserve University, we appreciate your time. Stay with us. We will have continuing coverage on what happens as the vote for the Speaker of the House in the 118th Congress continues. I'm Stephanie Haney.